For decades, Pakistan managed to avoid a choice that many countries across the Middle East eventually had to make. It maintained its support for Palestinian statehood. It refused to recognize Israel. And despite changing governments, shifting alliances, wars, peace agreements, and enormous geopolitical changes, that position remained remarkably consistent. Then a new proposal from Washington changed the conversation, because while most people were focused on negotiations involving Iran, President Donald Trump introduced an idea that unexpectedly pulled Pakistan into one of the most sensitive diplomatic debates in the world, a debate involving Israel. The Abraham Accords, the future of the Middle East, and perhaps most importantly, the price of peace itself. Pakistan's response came quickly, but the real story isn't that Pakistan said no. The real story is why Pakistan was included in the first place, and why one request from Washington suddenly placed Islamabad at the center of a much larger geopolitical puzzle. Over the past several years, the Middle East has experienced one of the most significant diplomatic transformations in modern history. Countries that spent decades refusing formal relations with Israel began changing their positions. The United Arab Emirates normalized relations, Bahrain followed, Morocco joined. Sudan also moved toward normalization. Together, these agreements became known as the Abraham Accords. Supporters viewed them as a breakthrough. Critics argued they bypassed unresolved Palestinian issues. But regardless of where people stood politically, one thing became clear: the diplomatic map of the Middle East was changing. And Donald Trump viewed the Accords as one of the defining achievements of his foreign policy. Now, years later, he appears to want something much larger, not just maintaining the Abraham Accords, expanding them significantly. Recently, Trump suggested that additional countries should join the framework, including Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Turkey, Egypt, and Jordan, as part of a broader regional vision connected to ongoing diplomatic efforts involving Iran. At first glance, this might sound like a routine diplomatic proposal, but for Pakistan, it was anything but routine, because Pakistan is not simply another country on a list. Pakistan occupies a very unique position in the Islamic world. And that is where the story becomes far more interesting. Imagine a country that possesses nuclear weapons, a country of more than 240 million people, a country with deep historical support for the Palestinian cause, a country that shares a border with Iran, and a country whose decisions are watched carefully across both South Asia and the Middle East. That's Pakistan. For decades, successive Pakistani governments maintained a consistent position. Recognition of Israel would only be possible after a just settlement of the Palestinian issue and the establishment of a Palestinian state. That position survived political transitions, military governments, civilian governments, regional crises, and changing global circumstances. Which means that when Trump included Pakistan in his broader vision, he wasn't merely inviting another nation into a diplomatic agreement. He was touching one of the most sensitive foreign policy questions in Pakistani politics, and the response reflected that reality. Pakistani officials quickly reiterated that their position had not changed. Recognition of Israel remained tied to a resolution of the Palestinian issue. The message was clear: Pakistan was not prepared to alter a policy that had existed for decades simply because regional circumstances had changed. But that response created another question. Why would Washington push the issue now? Why not 5 years ago? Why not 10 years ago? Why now? The answer may have less to do with Israel than many people realize, because this story is also about Iran. And once Iran enters the picture, everything becomes more complicated. Recent diplomatic discussions involving Iran have focused on reducing tensions, preventing escalation, and creating a framework for longer-term regional stability. Supporters of Trump's approach argue that expanding the Abraham Accords could strengthen a broader security architecture across the region. Their logic is relatively straightforward. If more countries establish formal diplomatic relationships with Israel, regional cooperation becomes easier, communication improves, economic ties expand, security coordination increases, and the chances of future conflicts potentially decrease. At least that is the theory. Critics see things differently. They argue that the question of Israeli recognition and the question of Iranian diplomacy are separate issues. According to this view, linking them together risks creating new complications rather than solving existing ones. Pakistan appears to lean closer to this second perspective. Officials emphasize that their role in diplomacy involving Iran should not automatically be connected to recognition of Israel. And that distinction matters because it reveals the core dilemma at the center of this story. Imagine you're sitting in Islamabad. You want stable relations with Washington. You want constructive engagement with regional partners. You want to avoid unnecessary diplomatic conflicts. You want economic stability. You want regional security. And at the same time, you have domestic political realities that cannot be ignored. Public opinion matters. Historical positions matter. Religious and political sensitivities matter. Now imagine all of those factors colliding at the exact same moment. That is essentially the challenge Pakistan faces. If it changes its position, there could be consequences. If it maintains its position, there could also be consequences. And if it simply avoids the conversation, the pressure does not disappear. In fact, it may increase. This is why the story has attracted so much attention among diplomats and analysts, because the issue isn't simply whether Pakistan recognizes Israel. The issue is what that decision would symbolize. Pakistan is the world's only nuclear-armed Muslim-majority nation. Any major shift in its position would be interpreted far beyond Pakistan's borders, across the Middle East, across South Asia, across international diplomatic circles. That symbolic significance is what makes this discussion so important. And it is also why Washington appears interested in bringing Pakistan into the conversation. Before we continue, if you enjoy clear breakdowns of geopolitics, diplomacy, and global power shifts, consider subscribing. We cover the stories behind the headlines and explain why they matter. Now back to the story. One of the most fascinating aspects of this situation is that both sides believe they are defending stability. Supporters of expanding the Abraham Accords argue that broader normalization can create a stronger foundation for peace. The more countries that participate, the stronger the diplomatic network becomes. The stronger the network becomes, the harder it becomes for conflicts to escalate. That is their argument. But critics argue that stability built without addressing unresolved Palestinian concerns may ultimately prove fragile. They believe recognition should come after a political solution rather than before it. Pakistan's position reflects this concern. For Islamabad, the Palestinian issue remains central. And that creates a challenge that cannot easily be solved through diplomatic pressure alone. Which brings us back to Trump's request. Because the request itself reveals something larger. It reveals how dramatically regional diplomacy is evolving. 20 years ago, a discussion involving Israel, Iran, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and the United States might have been viewed as several separate stories. Today, they increasingly appear connected. Energy security affects diplomacy. Diplomacy affects trade. Trade affects regional alliances. Regional alliances affect security arrangements. Everything influences everything else. And that interconnected reality is reshaping international politics. This is why a proposal involving Israel can suddenly become a major story in Pakistan, and why negotiations involving Iran can influence discussions that stretch far beyond Tehran. The diplomatic landscape is becoming more interconnected than ever before, which means decisions that once appeared isolated now carry broader consequences, and governments are being forced to think several moves ahead, much like a chess game. Every move changes the board, every decision creates new possibilities, every choice closes others. The interesting thing is that nobody knows exactly how this story ends. Pakistan could maintain its position indefinitely. Regional dynamics could evolve. Future negotiations could create new incentives. New governments could bring different priorities. Or the entire conversation could fade from the headlines as attention shifts elsewhere. All of those outcomes remain possible. But one thing is already clear. Pakistan has found itself in the spotlight, not because it sought the spotlight, not because it launched a major diplomatic initiative, but because broader regional negotiations unexpectedly pulled it into the center of the conversation. And that alone tells us something important. Pakistan's role in regional diplomacy is becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Whether Washington's broader vision succeeds or fails remains uncertain. If it changes its position, there could be consequences. Pakistan's role in regional diplomacy is becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Whether Washington's broader vision succeeds or fails remains uncertain. Whether the Abraham Accords continue expanding remains uncertain. Whether regional diplomacy ultimately produces lasting stability remains uncertain. But the significance of Pakistan's position is no longer in doubt. Because when discussions involving Israel, Iran, regional security, and the future of the Middle East all begin intersecting around a single country, that country suddenly matters a great deal. And right now, that country is Pakistan. The question isn't whether Pakistan answered Trump's request. The question is whether this debate is only just beginning. And if it is, the consequences could reach far beyond Pakistan, far beyond Israel, and far beyond the current headlines. Because sometimes the most important geopolitical stories are not about the decisions that have already been made. They're about the choices that countries are still trying to avoid. And right now, that may be exactly where Pakistan finds itself,